With the Investing News Network, I'm Scott Tibbles. I'm reporting from the floor of the International Mining and Resources Conference in Melbourne, or IMARC. And joining me now is Kylie Porter. Kylie is the Executive Director at Global Compact Network Australia. Thank you for joining me, Kylie.
Thank you, Scott.
So, for starters, for our listeners, can you tell me a little bit about what the Global Compact Network Australia is?
I sure can. So the Global Compact Network Australia is the Australian division of the United Nations Global Compact, which is the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative. So the initiative was set up in 2000 by Kofi Annan, and what it is a call to action to all businesses globally to operate under 10 universal principles that cover human rights, labour rights, environment and anti-corruption, and also to implement the Sustainable Development Goals.
Okay, and so we are at IMARC. Can you tell me what the Global Compact Network is doing at IMARC?
So the Global Compact Network Australia has actually is an associate partner with IMARC this year. And we are here predominantly today to talk about sustainable mining practices and also social licence to operate. So I chaired the first plenary session from this morning and really talked a lot about what the Sustainable Development Goals are, what the role of the mining sector is towards achieving those goals, but also how the mining sector can contribute more broadly to a decarbonised economy by 2050.
And from the Global Compact Network's point of view, what is the mining industry's role in decarbonising the economy?
The mining industry has a significant role in decarbonising. We actually wouldn't be able to decarbonise our economy without the mining sector. The mining sector contributes quite strongly, particularly with regard to the minerals and metals that it mines and how those minerals and metals are used in everyday processes. So anything from renewable energy-based technologies to some of the artificial intelligence and automation that we're seeing. So ultimately, the mining sector actually spurs that growth. They've also got a big responsibility in terms of actual decarbonisation. So those mining companies that are still producing, for example, thermal coal, they all need to have transition plans in place to reduce that reliance on fossil fuels. And with that, what we are actually seeing is a lot of the really big miners globally, and many of whom are here today, actually creating transition plans that outline a pathway to a 1.5 degree world. And that 1.5 degree pathway aligns with the Paris Agreement and also the International Convention on Climate Change report that came out late last year. And so they play an absolutely critical role in facilitating that transition.
And I'm sorry, but how does the compact work? Are these companies part of the compact, or do you work with them?
They are part of it. So globally there are 10,000 companies who are participants of the UN Global Compact. Here in Australia there are 176, of which a lot of the large miners who are here today, so for example BHP, Rio Tinto, Fortescue Metals, just to name a couple, are actually participants of the UN Global Compact and are members of the Global Compact Network Australia. So we work directly with them on a range of different initiatives, anywhere from the implementation of the Science-Based Target Initiative for a 1.5 degree world, getting their views on what it takes to have a just transition in the Australian economy, things around business and human rights and how you can work with communities better to advocate for those principles. But then we also work more broadly with the mining sector. So many companies who are not yet participants of the UN Global Compact but are very interested in learning how they can advance their own strategy and operation to become more sustainable and implement sustainability principles. So this might be anywhere from, for example, in 2 weeks' time we've got a dialogue on bribery and corruption, and Iluka Mining is going to be at that dialogue talking about their own experiences on bribery and corruption in Sierra Leone and some of the ways in which they combated that and how they've learnt to overcome it. But then we also talk to Iluka and other mining companies around what are some of the principles that they can be implementing to reduce corruption more broadly, prevent it, and also what we can do to help them understand what some of those risks are.
Okay, and so talking about the climate targets, this morning you said that we're not on track to meet our climate targets. So I guess the question is, what can the mining industry do more? And attached to that, how is the mining industry hitting its targets? Is it hitting any targets? What about that?
So What I said this morning was probably in two parts. So number one, we're not on track to meeting the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, but yes, we are not also on track to meeting a 1.5 degree world. At the moment, we're more likely to end up at a 3.5-ish degree world, which actually leads to devastating consequences for the environment. We are seeing shifts in the mining sector. There are definitely good players out there. You can tell that by the recent announcements by BHP, for example, and the investments they're making into decarbonisation. But what we need to see more of is a fundamental shift, not only in the Australian economy, but more broadly away from fossil fuels. So that means reducing our reliance on, for example, coal-fired power in Australia, and shifting our grid and our reliance on power to more renewable sources. And that's where the mining sector needs to actually play a critical role in looking at their asset base and looking at ways in which they can transform that away from coal. In Australia, we also need to be mindful of the impact that our coal exports will have on carbon emissions globally. And so again, those companies need to think about what are going to be stranded assets in the next 20, 30, 50 years. Is mining coal going to lead to my company being basically stranded, and not only stranded in terms of the assets that you own, but stranded in terms of a complete lack of investment? Recently there was a conference in Sydney with a group of investors, and in that conference it was quite interesting because the investors talked about the fact that they would much prefer to invest in a heavy carbon emitting company that has a clear transition plan to 1.5 degrees rather than a low carbon company that doesn't have a transition plan. And so my urge is that the mining sector starts thinking about what they need to put in place to be that company who the investors will invest in. And if that means making the hard decisions to thwart plans to open a new coal mine or thwart plans to open a new oil and gas pipeline and start instead investing in renewables, then that's something that they're going to need to do. So I think in terms of your question about how the mining industry fares, I couldn't call it out as a whole. There are good players and there are bad players. Today we see a lot of protesters out the front of IMARC, and they absolutely have a right to protest. But I think what the mining sector needs to do, particularly the good miners, is they need to go out there and they need to get in front of the public and get in front of the people who want to protest and help them to understand the real value that the good miners are playing in this move to decarbonisation. And as for the poor miners, they're going to have to step up. Otherwise, and probably within the next 5 to 10 years, they're going to lose that investment and they're going to fold. So overall, I wouldn't say that there's an overall 1 out of 10 rating for the mining sector. We definitely do. I mean, particularly for participants of the UN Global Compact, we actually see the mining sector as contributing really positively to sustainable development, not only in Australia but more broadly.
And obviously you've just mentioned the protesters outside. What about investors? Would you say that investors are sending a similar message to mining companies with where they're putting their money these days?
I think, again, probably similar to my answer with the mining companies, in that there are some investors who are absolutely sending that signal. Investor groups more and more are trying to understand what companies are doing in terms of their ESG management. But more and more we're actually having a lot of conversations with investors about what they're doing, what they're talking to companies about with regard to that company's transition plan and with regard to what a company is doing with relation to the Sustainable Development Goals. And what we've seen, particularly over the last couple of years, is a fundamental shift in how investors go and talk to companies and what those conversations are about. They've gone from sort of more, almost cosmetic conversations around environmental and social governance risks to actually deep conversations around, tell me what you are doing to contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. Please outline to me why your transition plan will only get us to a 2.5 degree world and not a 1.5 degree world. We're seeing a really large increase, particularly in Australia, of shareholder resolutions being raised by various investor groups as well, not only around climate change but around the human rights implications of climate change. And so I think overall you're absolutely seeing investor pressure increasing, and that investor pressure does obviously have an impact then on the executives within a company around the decisions that that company makes with regards to how it's going to manage its own environmental and social performance. So I think investors will, as it becomes more mainstream to ask those questions about the Sustainable Development Goals, to ask those questions about transition, what we will start to see is a decrease in the number of investors making investments into heavy fossil fuel related companies who don't have transition plans. And so the investor community is actually a crucial piece of the puzzle with this, and they need to be engaged and they need to understand what companies are doing. Having said that, there are still a lot of standard investment companies out there, a lot of those who invest in pension funds, for example, who might not have a clear ESG framework. And I think, again, over time, we're going to see that those investment portfolios actually decline in value compared to the ones that are taking consideration of things like the Sustainable Development Goals.
Wonderful. Well, we will wrap it up there then. Thank you so much for taking the time to have a chat with me, Kylie.
Thanks, Scott. Really appreciate it.
And once again, I'm Scott Tibbles, and I've been having a chat with Kylie Porter, and we are at the International Mining and Resources Conference in Melbourne.